now a pastor at Veritas Church in Cedar Rapids and works for change in poor communities, and he's going to be presenting today with his wife, Stephanie.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we're actually going to start the day off with activity. So I'll take a couple of them. I'm going to invite you guys not to open these. They're folded. I'm going to invite you to not open them. I'm going to give you instructions. Don't even take a peek. You guys all have writing utensils? I can hear if the fold opens, so.
Mr. Browning. I'm not going to be able to catch her.
I'm not very good at it, so I might.
Get you one?
Yeah, we have some.
Everybody got one?
You can share them. Unless you want.
Did you see Carter throw the ball? Did you see Carter at the half?
All right, I'm going to invite you to not open
half
them.
court shots. He threw the ball in the sticks.
Oh, yeah.
He was like,
Now, this, you'll see in the first column, that column that's visible, you'll see name and initial. I want you to write the name and initial of your top 10 friends, who are, and it can be family members, can be anybody related to. No, it can be anybody you're related to, but just your friends, so your top 10 friends. And if you don't have 10 friends, because 10 friends is a lot, I mean, let's just be honest. Anybody who you kind of look up to, mentor, anything like that. So books, podcasts, like the authors, people who you kind of look up to, mentors. Huh? Yeah, who you learn from. But it can't be like your mom or your dad or your brother, anything like that. So write as many people as you can.
Wait, so would you rather have their name or initial, or
This is
whatever you
this is
know?
whatever you want.
I'm
This
gonna
is,
write Tyler, too.
at the end of the day, you're going
He's
to
my
take these home.
friend.
Or you're going to take these home. So this is for you. So you know the initials, anything like that.
Matt Reynolds is
Oh, yeah.
Dang, look at this stuff.
Matt, I put you down.
How do you spell? No, I
It's just- I don't have any friends. My own friend doesn't know how to spell my name.
Oftentimes when I do this activity,
He's Matt.
I find that it's
Give me
really hard to
Ray-Bans.
find your top
I'm just gonna put
10 friends, but
E.
Okay.
Oh, I should put
You
BJ
guys-
as my friend.
C or a K?
C.
Yeah, I was just saying. Yeah.
Follow Suarez guys.
This is the only friends I have. I got Dan, cool. There you go.
Yo, I have you.
I guess Brittany's my friend.
guys, let me know.
Ashton
Look,
D, Nick E,
look up
Val
when you're done.
B, Elijah ES, Jake C, Cam E, Dan C.
I forgot Dan. I forgot Dan. No, what?
Did you need a pen? Did you need one?
I do. Can I have one too? I was just sharing.
So Browning, do you have one more?
Yep. John the Baptist.
What? Kevin needs a pen. We got more friends. Thank you.
I found it.
All right, so
Dan is a guy.
finish up. I'm actually going to invite you guys. You can keep writing down your friends. I'm going to invite you guys to open it. And what you will see is different categories. And I want you to, they're actually different attributes. So I want you to fill in the attributes to your friends according to the different columns.
He's Indian. What race are you? Like, are you not?
And me. I don't ask personal questions.
Elijah, what are you classified as? Light skin. Black.
We're all black. Oh, whoops. Same.
Club/sport.
Sexual orientation.
All my friends are white males. Well, that means you're racist.
I don't know yet.
Where does Jake Paul rate?
Religion. They're all Christian. Atheist.
I'm gonna just say straight for all of them because I don't know.
I'll give you guys another minute to finish.
You Christian? VJ's. What religion are you? Oh, yes.
Thanks for writing my name down, Cameron.
Are you a Christian?
I don't know
What's
yet.
your sexual orientation when you put a name down?
I mean, she has a boyfriend.
All
So
my
like,
white male Christians. Cameron, what religious group do you belong to? What religion?
is Arnie actually from there?
He's a Christian. Arnie is God. You're a Christian.
I don't know the rest of the answers, so. Wait, what is
When they say
club sports mean? What sports it
word
is?
is
Oh. Oh. You play that in softball, right?
South side is like
Keeyon plays
side
softball.
is like fury.
Volleyball.
putting more because all
Tyler.
have to be white.
Track, football,
On the north side, which
track. And so, that was what softball. Baseball. Maddie Hansen? Oh yeah, she does archery. Lauren?
I want to get an all white suit.
Lauren does it. Basketball, softball, volleyball.
All right, we look like we're done.
Bree does none. So she does tennis. And so does Megan. Who, Bree? Yeah. She didn't do tennis last year. She's very, oh. I'm just gonna go NA.
Well, as you guys finish that, again, my name is Keeyon Carter, and this is my wife, Stephanie. We're going to be presenting to you guys today. The topic, what we're going to be presenting is divided. How did we get here? So, kind of like what Stacy was talking about, we've come a long ways in America, but the reality is that as much as we have to celebrate, there are we still have to continue to keep going. And so one of the things we really want to talk about today is just the state of where we are right now. We are divided, and hopefully in the next 40 minutes we'll be able to kind of talk about some of the ways we are still divided, but then give you practical ways of how can we contribute to kind of uniting us. And so we started off with this top 10 and this top 10 activity. And I guess the first question I want to ask is, what are some of the things that you noticed about your top 10? Yeah, just shout out your answers, raise your
They're all
hand.
white males that are Christian, that
Same
live on the
gender.
north side, that go to Mount Vernon, and they're great.
All of mine but
Just
one
regular.
are white.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Anybody else? What are some things that you noticed about your top 10?
Lots of Christians.
Lots of Christians.
All of my friends go to Mount Vernon.
All your friends
Okay.
go to Mount Vernon?
I have friends from around, like around the country that I listed, but they all live in, like, even though the communities are, like, the cities are different, they're all pretty similar types of places.
Hmm. Any other observations? Any other observations? What are some of the things that affect who you hang around? What do you think? What are some of the things that affect who you hang around? Hmm?
The same interests.
Yeah.
Same interests?
Yeah.
Like the same things, same activities. Any other thoughts?
How about like a similar upbringing? Like your families are kind of the same.
Don't be shy. We're gonna have a kind of a communication, we're gonna be, social psychologist, Christina Cleveland, she's a professor at Duke University. She speaks about a lot of things that divide our country. And so one of the things that she has said is that we naturally are homogenous. And so what homogenous means is that we gravitate toward people who look like us, who act like us, who are kind of in the same same interests as us. This can range from looks, beliefs, hobbies, likes, dislikes, kind of like what Stephanie said, same kind of family structure. And so we're going to naturally gravitate toward people who are actually in our image, right? Right? And so as you take a look, take another look at your top 10, and I want to kind of have a short discussion on like some of those things, like how has even this quote from Christina Cleveland, how does that play a role in your life as you go to school, as you go home to your houses, your neighborhoods? How does that play a role kind of in your life? I remember when I was in high school, it was interesting. I went out for 3 sports, football, wrestling, track. And in each season, I would only hang out with that particular person or that whatever team I was on. Now, I would hang out with the football players or the track runners, every once in a while. But because I'm in this sport, I didn't want to try. So some of those things are going to kind of determine or move you to hang out with people who act like you are in the same clubs as you. So as you guys look at your top 10, what are some of the things that, as you look at even in your life, what are those clubs, what are those things that kind of moves you to gravitate toward certain groups? Go ahead.
Fortnite,
What was that?
a game.
Okay. So expound on that.
Xbox,
Like,
PS4.
Yeah, Xbox, people that play Fortnite, I hang around.
Okay. We're old, we have no idea what. We're older than we look.
So So kind of what you're saying is if you know somebody who's playing that game, whether it's in school or whether maybe you're in another even city, if you're in line and somebody's talking about, what's the game called? Fortnite, then that's a connection, right? And so even with that example, you just think about going into a new place. The first thing that you're going to be doing is you're going to be looking for people who are like you. So my next question is, that's some examples. What happens when lots of people gravitate toward people who are like them? This is a communication. This is an actual question. So, what happens? Yeah, what happens when people gravitate toward people who are like them?
You bond with similar people and you're like usually together all the time. Like you don't expand on your social life, I guess.
Right. Is it similar? I've been in high school for a while. So do people at the lunch tables, do you guys still all kind of like, you don't go to a table if you don't regularly sit there? Like the same people sit together all the time? Yeah, so what does it look like at lunch? Like what happens when at lunch the same people sit together all the time? Do cliques start to form and people only hang out with these people? You don't really get outside your circles? Still the same? Yeah.
Would you ever go sit at a new table randomly?
Right.
And why or why not? Like, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, I know the answer, no, you wouldn't do that, but why not, Matt?
Well, because if you don't really know the guy or people, it might be awkward for both of you
Yeah.
because some random person just sat down at your table.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be welcomed at a new table?
It depends.
Yeah,
Mhm.
depends on people.
And you just feel comfortable in the spot that you sit in, that you know, so you stay there.
Right. And the same is true as you get older, like us.
It doesn't stop.
It doesn't stop. So it's even like where you choose to buy a house. So neighborhoods are kind of built off of people with similar interests or incomes or beliefs and values. So that's when, oh, I'm supposed to be doing this part. Whoops. Divides start to happen, cliques start to happen, like the lunch table stuff, and stereotypes start to happen, like you think or assume things of other people that may or may not be true, but you're gonna believe those things because you're at a distance. And then we begin to know less and less about one another, which isn't good. And then we begin to get this mentality of like us versus those other people, or us versus them, which just furthers the divide.
Yeah, so the us versus them. So any kind of ism, racism, sexism, ageism, it kind of all can be dwindled down to us versus them. Cliques, you wouldn't jump to another table because that's them, right? But this table over here is us. And so these types of mental mechanisms they start really, really early in life. And we begin to actually operate on a us versus them. So obviously a huge one again is racism. It's us versus them. Now them, since we're very distant from them, we begin to either make narratives or we make up things that, because we're not close to them. So like when I was in high school, I didn't hang out with, I don't know, the theater club because I didn't know them, right? But the fact that we weren't in the same area, the fact that we never kind of crossed paths wasn't true, right? The fact that we weren't in the same classrooms wasn't true. I just went along with the us versus them mentality. And so that gets carried out in adulthood. And it's not something that's helping the divide in America. So there's a guy, he wrote a book called Divided by Faith. His name is Michael Emerson. And I want to quote one of the things he said. He said, we know less about each other now than we did in the 60s and 70s. And so this means that in the 60s and 70s, kind of what he's saying is that in those times, people were more in proximity to each other. And so when the laws in the 70s and when the laws in the 70s and the 60s and 70s were kind of passed to go against segregation, just because laws were lifted, segregation doesn't mean that hearts were going to be lifted, right? So like, for instance, if you were against integration in schools, if you ran a business and you were against, kind of this desegregation, do you think that a law is going to make you, do you think a law is going to make your heart change and just voila, you start to love people? So I'm going to hire blacks, I'm going to hire minorities, I'm going to be kind to them. No, that's not going to happen just by a law being changed. We know less about each other because we are, right now, we are further away from each other. And what I mean by each other, I am strictly talking white and black. We are further away from each other than we have ever been.
Can I talk a little
Yeah.
bit about what that means?
Yeah.
So, a lot of times back in like the 50s or 60s or before, after slavery ended, people still hired African Americans to work in their home in like as cleaning, as maids, those types of service things. So they still had African Americans in the home where you kind of get to know each other, right? So I'm not scared of Keeyon because he's coming into my home helping me with my kids or whatever that role looked like. But now, how often is it that a white family has a black person coming into their home?
Mm-hmm.
Probably not very often. So that's what he's saying, that we're farther apart than we were even then, because we're not ever like rubbing shoulders with each other.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really contributed to us kind of growing apart was this idea of this policy of redlining. And so here's a quick video of what redlining is, and then we're going to actually discuss it a little bit.
Owning a home is a cornerstone of it.
I guess I got to get out of this presentation.
Does anyone know what redlining is already? A few older people will know. Well, you guys are about to learn. This is good then.
Very good.
I forgot about this. Do teachers still use PowerPoints? We're going back and forth if this was even a thing anyone does anymore. Yeah, they do. Okay, we're afraid we're really outdated.
All right, it's a quick video.
Owning a home is a cornerstone of the American dream and a key to financial stability. But a history of racist housing policies has kept many Americans away from that dream. White Americans are almost twice as likely to own their homes as Black Americans. In the 1930s, Congress began insuring private mortgages, making it easier to own a home, at least if you were white. A government policy called redlining denied loans to people of color and anyone living near people of color, and made it nearly impossible for people of color to get a fair mortgage. Redlining was banned in 1968, but its legacy lives on. In 2015, Wisconsin's largest bank agreed to pay a $200 million settlement because it systematically denied mortgages to Black and Latinx applicants. And Black and Latinx homebuyers buyers still pay way more for mortgages than white buyers on average. Black families making about $100,000 live in the same kinds of neighborhoods as white people making $30,000. The federal government recently introduced strict new rules to hold cities more accountable for housing segregation. Will it be enough?
So that was a brief introduction to what redlining was and it is and how it still, and she mentioned that it still affects us. And so I'm just kind of gonna summarize what she said. So like redlining back in the 30s, basically banks were allowing, this is when mortgage loans were really booming, and banks were allowing just giving loans out, but some of the realtors and the banks would not give money to or give housing to African Americans, different minorities. And so that kind of created a divide, right? So like if you were in a poor neighborhood, or even if you were white and you lived next to a black neighborhood, you were less likely to be able to get a loan. And so how this plays out now is that actually a lot of the housing, even in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a lot of the realtors would kind of tell white and black owners where to live, and real estate agents were and contractors were actually building further and further away from minorities, and it was a very intentional thing. People wanted to live away from kind of the bad neighborhoods.
And it still happens today.
Yeah.
When we bought
So-
our house, our realtor didn't want us to buy the
So
house.
so tell them that story of.
So we were engaged and we put an offer on a house, and I was gonna live in the house before we got married, and our realtor said, I don't feel comfortable selling the house to you because it's in a bad neighborhood.
She was alone at the time.
Yeah.
I was at work, so she was talking to the realtor by herself.
And he said, I don't feel comfortable with you living in this neighborhood. It's primarily African Americans. I don't think you're gonna be safe. I don't want my name on this sale. You're gonna have to find another realtor. So, anyways, it still happens today, the discrimination towards different neighborhoods.
Can I add to that as
Yeah.
well? Like I grew up in Iowa City, and my wife and I just bought a house there.
Yeah.
And one of the things you might not know is that buying a house is how it's generational in the sense of like that's how you like invest, and your investment appreciates over time.
Right.
So buying a house is a really big deal as it goes forward, and you like pass on things to your children.
Right.
So it's a really big deal in kind of creating upward mobility in a lot of ways. Owning houses. When I was in high school in Iowa City, I grew up on the east side and I went to City High in Iowa City. And at that time, most of the new houses were being built on the east side, and not, now that you've seen some of this stuff, this will make sense to you, but most of the minority students went to West High at that time. And then what has ended up happening in like the last 20 years is the new houses are being built on the west side of town, and now most of the minority students go to City High. So like exactly what you're talking about, you could see it about every 20 years that where the houses are built starts shifting, and the African American, predominantly African American population, but minority populations go to the opposite school.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And you don't think of, you think of Iowa City as like a progressive town,
Yeah.
you know, like, but we're not talking about necessarily like the intentional redlining of the 1930s.
Right.
It's much more subtle.
Yes.
Yeah.
It still happens in this
Absolutely.
place.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I lived the last 23, my wife and I lived the last 23 years in the St. Louis area. And in our subdivision, a very nice subdivision, the biggest, nicest house on our block was owned by an African-American family. My wife comes home from work one day, and it's the first house in the subdivision. And there are two police officers out in front of this house, and they have the owner of the house, African-American gentleman, basically up against the car and interrogating him.
Wow.
And my wife stopped and took her almost 10 minutes to convince the police officers, this is the owner
Oh my
of the
goodness.
house.
Absolutely.
And this was 2008, that was 2016.
Wow.
Wow.
Mhm.
So redlining is, the effects of redlining is still happening in psychological ways and ways that are very, just very visible now. And you might ask, like, if redlining is horrible, but like the video said, it ended in 1968. So if redlining is illegal, why would it still be happening now? Or why would people still be acting like that, or real estate agents be acting like that? Well, it's a subtle thing. It's a subtle thing, and another question might be, if it ended, why can't African Americans just build enough money to move? Again, the subtleness of realtors, but also if we take, say, my grandma, if she was a product of redlining, right, back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, that means that she wasn't really building any money at all, right? She was probably in a really crappy house, and my mother was in a crappy house, and so there was no money to accrue. And so by the time 1968 happened, well, that's cool, but I don't have any money, and then the next generation doesn't have any money as well, and so lots of I would say segregated laws continue. So laws, one of the things I really want you guys to really understand is that laws don't change hearts, right? So like your mom can tell you to not do something, but what are you gonna do? Like an hour later, you're gonna do exactly what she told you not to do. And so laws don't change hearts, right? And so I want to look at, these are some kind of proof of the division that's going on in America. So these are, you can hold it right there. So these are, maybe the lights. So this is called a dot map. If you want to look it up, you can Google dot map. And what it is it's a demographic map, and it's a census of 2010. So another one's going to come out, and I think actually in 2 years, or even sooner than that, because I think they published it earlier. So the blue that you see represents white, the green represents black, Asian,
orange is Hispanic.
and then there's some brown, there's others. And so this is Baton Rouge 2010. And can you guys kind of see the visible division? You know that it's almost like all blacks up there, all whites up there, and then a few spots of clusters.
So it's like the lunch tables, only this is based on race.
Mhm.
So we're separated.
Mm-hmm. Go to another. This is Chicago. Anybody been to Chicago? So do you see the clusters? There's some African Americans over there to the right, and then kind of where the blue goes is kind of where the suburbs are. You can go to the next one. Detroit. This is crazy.
And you can see it, kind of a theme in all of these is like the city center is typically African Americans, and the farther you go out,
Yeah.
whites have moved out into that area.
So as we go through these maps, they tell a story. Right now you see, okay, so black people live over here, white people live over there, and that's separation. But that also means that there's separation. There's schools in those black neighborhoods. There's churches in those black neighborhoods. There's parks in those black neighborhoods. So do you think that the green is going to go over to the blue to play, or do you think the blue is going to go over to the green areas to go to school? So that means that schools may be even more segregated now than they were in the 70s. You can keep going. So this is Waterloo, Iowa, hours north of here. Waterloo, Iowa. That's where I'm from. It's still, I think it's top 100 most segregated cities in America. And so, so this is the Cedar River, this right here, that kind of white area. And then this is it's the north side, but we call it the south side. If you guys know Cedar Rapids, or we call it the east side. Cedar Rapids is weird with angles, we are too. So this is where basically all the African Americans live. This is kind of like Section 8 housing, government housing, stuff like that. Back in like the 70s, there was a triangle that realtors right here. They only let African Americans stay right there, and it's still true today. Yeah.
Cedar Rapids.
And here's Cedar Rapids. So this is downtown area. The church I work at is somewhere right here.
And Mount Vernon.
Here's Mount Vernon. This is the closest.
Yeah, we tried to
I tried to zoom even more. I see a couple of
There's some
white, there's
brown
Asian,
dots,
some
kind of.
brown dots.
You
Yeah.
look real close.
So,
But what
go ahead.
happens when we live so far apart? It's just like what we talked about earlier. We're gonna make up stories of someone who looks different than us, of like what they're like, how they behave. You're gonna believe every crazy stereotype that you hear on the news or in movies and music, all that kind of stuff. And then we start to like fear and distrust people who look different than us. I always tell this story of, it gets me so mad because in the last 4 years of us being married, I cannot have him do any errands that involve returning anything at the store. Because how many of your parents like buy something and you need to take it back to Target or Walmart or whatever, right? Common thing. I always have to run those errands because if we have the receipt or if we don't have the receipt, they bring up security 9 out of 10 times, ask him crazy questions. It takes 2 hours. They don't believe him because they distrust him. Because he looks a certain way, his dreads might scare someone because they've never seen anyone with dreads. His darker skin, they immediately associate him with crime or something crazy. I don't know what narrative they're believing in their mind. But because we live so far apart, we're going to believe those things and operate on those things when little did they know he's a pastor with a toddler and wife at home who's now cooking another child. So anyways, he's pretty, like, trustworthy.
What are you trying to return? Like baby clothes and
Yeah, it's
diapers
like,
and
I
stuff,
bought the
right?
wrong size diapers, or
One time it was like a fruit or some
oh,
kind of.
he bought nighttime cold medicine when I was a little nervous to give that to a toddler. I was like, well, we probably shouldn't do the toddler nighttime. I don't know what that's going to do to them. But anyways, so these assumptions usually are not accurate. Another question, being in an interracial marriage, we get lots of questions or strange things said to us, but the thing that stands out to me the most is people will ask me, so does Keeyon work? Rather than you usually ask the wife or the girlfriend or whatever the relationship is, like, where does your significant other work? But I get, does he even work? Like, what's he doing? When that's the assumption and stereotype people have of a black man, which is terrible. And also in the hospital, they asked if I actually wanted his name on the birth certificate, even though we were married. So, anyways, these things exist and happen still today. It's just not as overt like we saw in the video. It's very subtle, which Keeyon will talk a little bit about now.
Yeah. So Michael Emerson, the guy who wrote the book Divided by Faith, he believes that we live in what he calls a racialized society. So if you take a note, this is a good thing to write down. And what a racialized society means is it's a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. So basically he's saying we live in a country where your race actually matters, and it's going to determine a lot of things and a lot of experiences, whether you're white, black, Native American, Asian, any of that. And so he goes on to try to define racism, but he says that a major part of our problem with this division and understanding racism is that we in 2018, we define racism as kind of irrational instances. So when we hear the word racism, we think about the KKK. We think about what happened in Charlottesville. We think about the crazy things that's happening on the news about, unarmed black men dying. And though those are definitely the extreme piece of racism, we would call that overt. That is not the fullness of racism. Racism is very complex. And so what Michael Emerson, the author, the way he defines racism is, he says that racism today is increasingly covert. So covert is a word that you're going to want to coin. So number one, it's increasingly covert. It's embedded in our normal operations and institutions. And it's mostly invisible to the majority culture.
So the person that asked me, does my husband work? He or she doesn't know that that is a racially charged question. That's how subtle it is. Mm-hmm. And it's invisible to that person.
So covert racism. So covert is something that we all struggle with. Because covert has to do with kind of the under the radar type of discrimination, or the things that are brought about by division. Now, we can be covert about a lot of things. I was talking to a friend about a week ago, and he was telling me that his father is in his 90s, and we began to talk about how like I'm really appreciative of Stephanie's grandparents, because I never really got to grow up with grandparents, and I'm really like I'm at awe at like her grandparents being 90 years old, but they're mentally there. Because when I was 15, and whenever I thought about an old person, I just thought that they had lost their mind. You know what I mean? Like to me, old people were just, I didn't hang out with them. If you had gray hair, you're just out of your mind. And so that is because I never interacted with old people. And so this covertness, this under the radar, you develop opinions, you develop